Okay, so hello, Bob Putnam. I am so happy to be talking with you today.
I'm glad to be speaking with you, David. It turns out unexpectedly we share very similar interests.
We do, and we're here to discuss this wonderful essay that you wrote with Eric Anderson and Sarah Gustafson titled Two Voyages of Discovery, How the 1831 Journeys of Darwin and Tocqueville Changed Our Understanding of the World. And let me quote a few passages from the essay to set the tone for our listeners. You say, finally, and this is our most timely discovery, each produced a major theory of biology and society, respectively, that recognized the tension between the individual and the community, and they forged remarkably parallel theoretical syntheses of competition and cooperation. And then you say, in short, Darwin's theory of evolution and Tocqueville's theory of democracy can be mapped directly onto one another. And so I like to think that this conversation is you channeling Tocqueville and me channeling Darwin. So tell
Sure.
us more about the essay and what inspired you to make this wonderful comparison between two voyages that they started within a few months of each other in 1831.
Well, what inspired me, I think, was I noticed once by accident that these two young men. It's important to emphasize they're young men, had left Europe within months of each other, as you say, in 1831. They both headed off on voyages of discovery. You and your listeners will know more about Darwin's voyage of discovery, which was headed towards mostly Latin America. And the part that I knew more was that Alexis de Tocqueville, who is one of the most widely cited social theorists, even today, had set off from England, not from France. From France, not from England, and he was headed to North America. They both completed these voyages. There are astonishing parallels actually between these two guys. First of all, they're very young. They had both been, neither had been seen as a genius as a young person, but they had both been very well educated. And that, I think, is important in both cases because they both had what, I've now forgotten who's, the French scientist who referred later in the century, actually, to the importance of a prepared mind. Both of them on their voyages, set out on their voyages, not knowing what they would find, but having read a lot of other stuff. History and law, in Tocqueville's case, geology and botany and so on in Darwin's case. They both had the habit of keeping very detailed daily journals, which is partly why we know so much about the two voyages. They both they had this, I think this is in some respects the most interesting similarity between the two of them. They both had this capacity to do unbelievably detailed descriptions, empirical descriptions of what they were seeing. In that sense, they were both exquisite empiricists, and you know the things that, the particular leaves or the particular fossils or whatever that Darwin was seeing on his voyage. But similarly, Tocqueville was not interested in the flowers and plants, but he was interested in the people, and the people of America. I should say he was going on his voyage partly because he thought that democracy as a form of government and society might be the future of Europe. It was not characteristic of Europe, but it was characteristic of America. And he thought, well, I'll go there and see what I can learn about how America, what democracy looks like in America. And indeed, the title of his book is Democracy in America.
Yeah.
And so they both had that in common. Tocqueville, as I started to say before, Tocqueville spent endless hours talking with the most amazingly diverse people. He talked to several American presidents, several American past presidents, but also frontiersmen's wives, even what at the time would have been the bottom of the social hierarchy, black slaves. Indeed, they both talked to black slaves in the course of their voyages. But Tocqueville had this amazing voyage that went through all parts of then the United States of America. And he noticed lots of things. He noticed, for example, which would become much more important later on, the issue of race in America and the likelihood that that would lead, he thought, to some kind of civil war, which of course...
Yeah, he was amazingly prescient.
30 years later it did. Indeed, and I could get carried away thinking about the parallels between these two. They both actually happened by chance to encounter the expulsion of Native Americans. Native Americans in North America, this was while he was going down the Mississippi River, Tocqueville by accident, ran into a bunch of Indians, Native Americans, who were being forced from their ancestral homes out onto the plains. Something called, in American history, it's called the Trail of Tears.
Yeah.
And also, Darwin discovered had a very similar episode in which he discovered, I think down in Argentina, some Native Americans, but Native Americans in Latin America who were being driven off to the frontiers, and they both actually foresaw that would sort of be the end of those two historic communities, the Native Americans both in the North and South. Well, I'm going on too long, but the other thing I want to say is, in addition to this incredible focus on narrow details, I think in some respects the most striking thing to me is that they both had the capacity to go almost instantly from what they were seeing before them to they saw the big theoretical picture at the almost same instant.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah.
And you and your listeners will remember someplace on the west coast of South America, Chile, I think it was, Darwin, in the midst of an earthquake, which he described in poetic terms. They both were very good writers after that.
Very good writers, yeah.
And Darwin in Argentina describing this earthquake that's happening, and he describes it in poetic detail, what was happening at the moment that he experienced this. But in almost the same breath, he began thinking about, well, what are the implications? What does this tell us? This says something. Go ahead.
About geology. What does this tell us about the shape of the continents?
Yeah, the shape of the continent and even the age of the world. I mean, it was quite astonishing, and there were so many similar episodes during Tocqueville's trip. I mean, one that I'm not going to be able to recount verbatim here, but he was visiting a 4th of July celebration in Albany, New York, of all places, and in his diary he describes what's happening before him succinctly but brilliantly describes the parades and the flags and so on. And at the very same moment, he's describing how American democracy differs from French autocracy. I've sometimes used the metaphor of a scrim. That is, a scrim is a semi-permeable cloth that hangs in a theatrical in a theater, in which one thing is being presented on the scrim, but you can see through that to what lies behind it, and that's what he's doing. At the same moment, he's seeing what's before him, and also this great. Well, okay. Anyway, I immensely, but I want to get to the core of what brings us together. They both. Well, there is a common duality at least in social sciences, between individualism and collectivism, or individualism and communitarianism. That permeates all sorts of commentaries on social life, international life, and so on. And at first glance, you'd think that these are the two extreme versions of that. That is, Darwin, the extreme individualists, red in tooth and claw, all about conflict, not at all about cooperation. And on the other hand, Tocqueville is the patron saint of American communitarianism. I mean, he's the person that who also write about, in my own work, I mean, I write about community and the importance of community, what I call social capital. he's the patron saint. He's, I'm sometimes talked about as the 21st century equivalent of Tocqueville. So we both are very much emphasizing community. But, and this is the key point, both of them actually underneath had a much more complicated conception. Darwin was not all about competition. He was also about cooperation, and how even cooperation could have been important in human evolution.
Especially in human evolution.
And we can talk later about that, because you know much more about that than I do. But on the other hand, Tocqueville, who's thought of as this patron saint of community, invented the word individualism. That is, he's the first person who ever used the term, so he was perfectly aware that Americans were very individualistic. And he, therefore, had to have a way of showing how American individualism was compatible with this idea about community that he saw everywhere. I mean, there are a million quotes about how Tocqueville is always seeing Americans just spontaneously collaborating. But he said the way Americans could reconcile their individualism with their propensity for community is that Americans had followed what he called the principle of enlightened self-interest. That is, Americans did think about self-interest, but they thought about self-interest in terms of their long-run interest and not just in terms of their short-run interest. So my short-run interest might be in, winning this particular political battle, but my long-run interest, he said, would be better served by cooperation.
And you call that self-interest rightly understood, right?
Exactly right.
The title of his chapter is How the Americans Combat Individualism by the Doctrine of Self-Interest Rightly Understood. So he made a contrast between individualism and self-interest rightly understood. So his term individualism must have referred to the more limited short-term version that you just referred to, right?
Yeah.
And then, so what that means is that self-interest rightly understood has two poles. One is the individual, and the other is the welfare of the community. Right. And then they become aligned with each other, basically. But there are two poles. You can't think about self-interest rightly understood without thinking about society and for the good of society. Is that safe to say?
Yes, and the last point I would want to make, and then we can, of course, go into more detail as you'd like, but the last point I would like to make is that idea, that is, that you have to reconcile, you have to think constantly both about self-interest and about collective interest, is unbelievably relevant to our politics today in America.
Sure.
You think about masks, or you think about global warming. Global warming, for example, is a classic example of a dilemma of collective action. I personally can't do anything about global warming. I mean, if I turned off the lights and lived in the woods up here in a very primitive way, that would not do a thing to affect global action. Global warming. It requires collective action, but it requires my thinking about my self-interest, which is not just in having a nice, comfortable day here, but using lots of electricity and so on. That's my self-interest, but my self-interest rightly understood says, no, think about your interest in the long run, which is actually the same as other people's interest in the long run, which is stopping global warming. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense, Bob. And I want to focus on the need for structure. And let me set it up in a few minutes, because Darwin, just to take my turn on Darwin, what he realized was that a theory of natural selection just based on individual competition among individuals could not explain anything communitarian, because anything communitarian involves individuals extending themselves on behalf of other individuals or their groups. And so this recognition forced him to add a layer of natural selection onto individual level competition, which is group level competition. Not hard to understand.
Right.
Not hard to understand. And it's at that point that he started to talk about communities and especially in his thinking on human evolution, recognizing cooperation and all of the sympathetic emotions, love. He used the word love more than the word competition. And the need for so So, and then of course today that's represented by the theory of multi-level selection, which I represent. But I think
Right.
the key point to make, and it could be made via Darwin or it could be made via Tocqueville, is that for cooperation to succeed, structure is necessary. I think that it's easy to take away from your work. I think many do, including the wonderful documentary on your life and work, Join or Die, that groups are unconditionally good. And but I think that what we all know and what Darwin and Tocqueville saw is that groups require a certain structure to work. I mean, cooperation by definition is vulnerable to exploitation in groups of any size. And so therefore, unless you have the right structure to prevent that kind of disruptive competition from taking place, groups of any size won't work. So now for me, Bob, Elinor Ostrom represents a giant in this field, both her core design principles for governance within groups and the concept of polycentric governance for coordination among groups. And I'm so eager to ask you, in the first place, did you interact with Elinor Ostrom? I was lucky to collaborate with her for 3 years just prior to her death. And I'm dying to know how much you think about her work, how you relate her work to your work, and your own thoughts about the need for structure, appropriate structure,
Right.
in order for groups to function well.
I knew her very well, and maybe if you don't mind, I'll just spend a few minutes describing my work and Lynn's work.
Please, that's what I'm hoping for.
Well, I guess I'd start back a little further out here. I mean, I'm a photographer, so I think in terms of wide angle and close focus, and I'm going to start with a wide angle and then move to a closer focus. Social capital was in the air in the early 1990s, and it was certainly true for Lynn, and it was true for me, and we were aware of one another's work, and I'm sure in some sense both. I mean, I cited her work in mine, and she cited my work in hers, so we were obviously in that sense aware of one another's work. But I think it's not so much that either of us influenced the other as that both of us were influenced by, I know that it's vague to say something was in the air, but I think often in scientific terms, in scientific situations, that is true. A lot of people, not just one person, is thinking about an idea, and that was true for us. Not everybody used the same definition or concept of social capital in that period. I'm sure that must be true that not everyone uses the term evolution in the same way. But Lynn and I were very much thinking along the same lines, and it's not up to me to say how much of that was either one of us influencing the other, or how much of it was, as I say, in the air. I mean, I could talk a little bit, but I won't now, about what was in the air politically at that time, because it was certainly true that politically people were interested in this idea of could we have a more, could we have a policy that was more focused on how people can cooperate rather than just a more conflictful interpretation of politics. But in any event, we were thinking along the same lines. For example, and different from a lot of people at the time, we both thought that social capital could be good or bad. That is, you could use cooperation for good purposes, and that's what we were both interested in. But we both knew that gangs or the Ku Klux Klan was another example of social capital being used for bad purposes. That's a crucial issue that both of us understood, and a lot of people didn't at that point. Secondly, we were both quite familiar with game theory, and although she put a lot of game theory up front in her book, I didn't put it up front in my book, but I knew game theory quite well, actually, because earlier in my life, I'd been a close, and still am, a close friend of a guy named Bob Axelrod, who'd worked a lot on game theory, and I just picked up a lot from Bob as a friend.
So just for our listeners, Bob Axelrod was the person who organized the famous computer tournament of game theory strategies, which identified tit for tat as the winner in many cases. So keep on going.
That's certainly true, and again, I knew Bob's work. I'm sure. Well, I know for a fact that Lynn knew his work. But the main point is both of us thought in those terms. She was much more explicit about it. If you read my works, especially, well, either Making Democracy Work, which was my first work in this field, or Bowling Alone, which is probably my most well-known work, you could see that I knew I was understanding it in game theoretic terms, but I didn't. And in particular, we were both focused on problems of collective action. That is, she was, and I'll say in a minute where we were different, but we both were worried about, I hope that your listeners will know what a dilemma of collective action is, but a dilemma of collective action is some situation in which, prisoner's dilemma is a commonly used example, both parties share a common interest. They both would like to go to the same place, but without some external force, some Hobbesian ruler to force them to do, they both end up following their short-run interest and not successfully achieving what would leave them both better off. I knew that, Lynn knew that, and we both thought of social capital as a way of resolving that dilemma of collective action. So at the core of both her work and my work was this idea that social capital, why was social capital interesting at all? Because it could enable you to get to a better position. If you had a lot of the right kind of social capital, you could be better off. In my terms, you'd have better government. In her terms, you'd have more effective irrigation systems. But in both cases, you'd be better off if you had the good fortune to be living in a community that had a lot of the right kind of social capital, or if you were somehow able to create the right kind of social capital. Now, how did we differ? Well, in the first instance, Lynn was mostly interested in economic development and mostly interested in economic development in the third world, as we would then put it, that is the less developed part of the world. And I was and she knew about American democracy, but she was not focused on that empirically. I was much more focused on that, on American democracy, and more generally, I was focused on politics in the advanced world, and she was focused on economic outcomes in the less developed world. I sometimes say that I'm a political scientist, but I invented the term social capital. I didn't invent it, but I adopted the term social capital because I thought that the economists had the right methods and rigor, and the sociologists had the right variables, and I thought if I called it social capital, I could get the economists and the sociologists to start fighting, and everybody would benefit from that.
Yeah, I think you were right. I think you were right to frame it in economics terms, I think, or actually to join the sociological mindset with the economic mindset, I think
Right.
is one reason why it became so influential.
I think that's probably true. Another difference, so as I said, one difference is she was mostly focused on economic outcomes, and in the developing world, and I was more focused on political outcomes, particularly democracy, but not only democracy. I was interested in trying to explain why in my first book, Using Social Capital, my interest there was in Italy, of all places. I don't want to try to summarize that book for you, but
Well, Bob, let me just tell you, that book is one of my all-time favorites. I love that book. I'm quoting from it all the time. That's such a genius book. So now I'm being a fanboy, but I'll continue. And now I got that off my chest. So,
I appreciate
continue.
Well, which I will say then in maybe two sentences. The book in Italy was an attempt to understand why some parts of Italy were better governed than other parts of Italy, democratically, but by any means. Some places in Italy you could get a response right away if you sent a letter to your local consular, and some places they never answered the letter. So I've been in all sorts, not just democratic, but in all sorts of ways. Some governments were more efficient, were higher performance institutions, and others were much poorer. And so therefore the research question was, well, what explains this? And I won't go through the long process by which I interrogated many other possible causes, but the short answer is it turned out to be choral societies, that is, singing groups, and other kinds of
well, and guilds and groups of all sizes, bird watching societies, just
Exactly.
the density, and basically horizontal interactions compared to vertical interactions.
That's right.
And you
That's
quote from Eastern Europe, I think, the proverb, when your neighbor's house is on fire, carry water to your own.
That's right. Well, in any case, that's where I first got introduced to this idea of social capital as a precondition, and the more I began to look at it, it was a precondition for lots of things. I mean, it wasn't just that the government worked better, but the educational system worked better, people lived longer. I mean, a million good things, controlling for everything else you'd like, a million good things flowed from these connections we had with other people of the right sort. Now, and so I was mentioning before, Lynn and I agreed about a lot of things. We certainly agreed about thinking in game theoretic terms. We both recognized the value in one another's work. We were working in parallel, so to speak. I was cheering her on, and she was cheering me on, and we were learning from each other, but we were working in separate little fields. And we both recognized, and this is interesting, I went back to Lynn's work in preparing for this. She wrote a paper, I've got someplace here, in which she said, social capital, fad or fundamental. That is, there was a risk that she and I understood that social capital would just become a nifty word for warm, cuddly feelings or something, and without any underneath logic. And therefore, both of us were really concerned about, well, not just is this a label for warm, cuddly feelings, but is it what's going on analytically when you find in places where social capital is working. And I guess I would say the last thing, and this comes much closer to what you want to talk about, we both recognized that self-organized governance, local institutions, organized by individual farmers, if we're talking about an irrigation system, or individual communities in America, individual counties, individual towns in America, were more likely to be effective than some centrally developed top-down framework.
So in many cases, small is beautiful in many cases. Although the concept of polycentric governance, as you know, means it all depends. In some contexts, does need to be large scale. The concept of federalism, the concept of subsidiarity,
yes,
all of these things are arguing really for multiple scales of organization, not just the small scale, but the small scale, I would say, is the one that's often left out, and so needs to be recognized more. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would completely. Let me give you an example of America that I've often used, and used most recently in a book that I wrote with a woman named Shailene Romney Garrett. The book is called The Upswing. I won't try to summarize the whole upswing, but the basic idea is there was an earlier period in American history, around 1900 to 1910, which was called the Progressive Era, and in that period, America turned a corner from being in awful shape, high inequality, high political polarization, low social connections, very self-centered. That was the way it was at the end of the 19th century because of the Industrial Revolution, basically. And that's the way we're in now. We're exactly in that situation now of extremely high polarization, extremely high inequality, very self-centered politics. But therefore, we looked in that book, we looked at what was happening when we turned it around the last time, because that's what's relevant to us now. If we could figure out what they did then, we could do it now. And I want to now come to the issue of one example from that period of when and why bottom-up works best. And it is a simple one. In 1910, plus or minus 1 or 2 years, Americans invented the public high school. Never in world history had there been high schools, but private high schools you had to go to and pay. But which I'm talking about, every kid in town, just because they're a kid in town, gets 4 years of free secondary education. And that was invented, that's the right word to use, invented for the first time in world history in America. But now where in America? That idea did not come from Harvard. They did not come from Washington, D.C. or New York or San Francisco. It came from small towns in flyover country. And it was a bottom-up idea. At least initially it was a bottom-up idea. And it turned out to be the best idea. It was an incredibly good idea because from that, and there's a lot of good research on that, from the institution of universal higher education. First of all, it spread instantly. It was such a good idea that it went viral, but we didn't, before we had the internet or anything. It went viral so that within about 20 years, virtually every place in America had a high school. I mean, think of that. Begins at a little, podunk place in Iowa, and without any internet.
Well, let me pair that, Bob, with we talk a lot about bottom up meets enlightened top down, and so you've given a great example of bottom up, but another example of enlightened top down is the U.S. Postal Service.
Yes.
And which really required a top down effort, and it had amazing consequences. I think Tocqueville himself said, he described like slogging his way through the wilderness, and he comes to some little cabin someplace, and that person is reading a newspaper or something from the post. You can tell that story better than me, but well,
I want to say one more thing though about the high school, if I can.
Sure.
It's relevant to the top down issue. The idea came bottom up, but the power of the high school really only developed when the federal government put in lots of money in the 30s and 40s. So I'm not saying it's just bottom up all the way. I'm saying it's bottom up, but also combined with top down. That is my example, as well as the post office.
Yeah, good.
A good example of how it's got to be, in terms of governance, it's got to be this dialectic relationship.
Yeah, Bob, let me insert. They didn't use the E word. We didn't even use the E word. Well, what took place there is a conscious process of cultural evolution. It was just basically good ideas being noticed and spreading, and that having to be an intentional process. So I think in modern terms, and what I think is so important is to frame this rigorously in modern language, is that what took place there, what actually takes place in every positive change effort historically and in the present, is a deliberative process of cultural evolution, typically at the systemic scale, where we're trying to get things to work. We experiment, we find best practices, we do it again and again, and there's an architecture that's required for that. The more clearly we see that, then the better we'll be able to do it, I think, to solve our current problems.
Well, can I just add a personal note as an example of that?
Sure.
I'm going to be speaking personally. I don't want to just understand America. I want to change America. I want to let America move in a better direction. And I've been working on that project for 50 years since I first began with the book on Italy. Now, of course, you might say, well, you've been working for 50 years and it's gotten worse, Bob. What are you, aren't you to blame somehow for the problems? I don't want to take blame for the problems, but I do want to say this. I've spent a lot of time on research, obviously, over those 50 years, but increasingly I've been trying to reach out. I'm speaking to your question about how we make change, and I've tried to reach out in two ways. First of all, I actually have welcomed opportunities to speak nationally. I happen to, for accidental reasons, partly because the term bowling alone happened to be a neat title, and maybe who knows why, I've got a pretty nice national platform, and from that national platform, I've advised, and now, I'm sorry, this is name dropping, I've worked personally with 6 of the last 8 American presidents. I did not work, starting with Jimmy Carter actually, but then I didn't work with Reagan. I did work with the Bushes, and I didn't work with the guy who was most recently president and is trying to be president again, the guy who's on trial in New York City today. I didn't work with him, but every other president, including Biden, I've worked with personally. So that's this top down. I mean, I'm trying to use this bully pulpit. Well, in addition, I've traveled, and again, this sounds like tooting my own horn. I'm just trying to illustrate the top down part and the bottom up.
Don't worry about appearing egoistic, Bob.
I've spoken to several thousand community meetings all across America, from Duluth to Tallahassee to New York and Philadelphia and Boston to San Diego and all points in between. Various Springfields. It turns out there are a number of places named Springfield in America, and I've talked in many of them. And to public audiences. I don't mean just talking to a few people. Yeah. So, you add it all up, maybe 1 million people I've spoken to, and okay, so that's more bragging, and my mom would have washed my mouth out at this point in what I'm saying. But what I mean to be saying is, this is the point I'm trying to say. I personally have been following both a top-down and a bottom-up approach to what you might call cultural change, actually. I mean, I'm trying to get Americans to, I want to get Americans to understand how we can fix America.
I want to bring in, Bob, I want to bring in Peter Turchin. Has he appeared on your radar screen yet, Peter Turchin?
Yes.
So his book, Ages of Discord, elaborates on what you were talking about and shows a roller coaster of social equality and social inequality. So back to Tocqueville, historians call that the era of good feelings. That was the 1835 or so, 1830s.
Right.
And then so there was your peak, and then that slid into the Gilded Age. There was your valley, and then that rose to, I guess, the New Deal, which was only a good deal for some. Let us note that, but still was a good deal for some. So there's your second peak, and now back down with their Thatcher and Reagan era. Back down to the second Gilded Age, in which hopefully there is an upturn, an upswing, the title of your book. But I think the more clearly we see that, and we see that American history has been a roller coaster, and of course we want to achieve a peak and stay at it this time, not slide down to some other valley. And I think the more clearly we can see that, the more we could actually climb the next peak and stay there. I think that would be possible.
I want to slightly qualify Turchin's account of American history.
Good.
I agree, and a lot of his curves are parallel to the curves in my book, The Upswing. However, the more closely Shailene Romney Garrett, my co-author, and I looked at the data we looked at, the more we began to see that people have agency. That's just jargon for saying you're not condemned. It's not like a pendulum swinging back and forth.
No, Peter wouldn't say that it is, but keep going.
You have to push the pendulum.
Yeah.
It was not inevitable 125 years ago that we would turn things around. That was not inevitable. It happened because individual Americans, the leaders of the progressive movement, acted that way. Indeed, at that time, most people in America thought we're going to hell in a handbasket and we're never going to get out of this.
Well, the story I heard is that when Roosevelt became president, he said, either I'm going to be the best president, what did it say, or the last president. He said, I'm either going to be the best president or the last. That's the degree to which the whole ship was perceived at going down. And he was called a traitor to his class.
Yes.
So those are the elites that Peter Turchin talks about, and then.
But let's apply that same principle, that same perspective to today. Is it inevitable? I think we're headed in a very bad direction right now, and a lot's going to turn. Maybe not everything, but a lot's going to turn on the outcome of this fall's election. But
yes.
I think so. I think that's not determined.
Right.
I'm back to this point that we can choose what future we want. Not perfectly, but we can choose what.
Yeah, I mean, if Peter's work suggests otherwise, then I think I would disagree also. But I think Peter would say that's would disagree with that interpretation as well. So the important thing is, as you say, we do have agency. We can turn things around, and thankfully the bottom-up component means is that anybody can take part in the bottom-up part of that. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be a big fish. You don't have to be a corporate giant. No matter who you are, you work with groups, and you could form those groups. And yes, let those groups be appropriately structured because that's a huge part of it. And those groups get connected to other groups. And if you're in a position to be enlightened top-down, if you're like the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, who does seem to see things clearly, then you can make it happen even even faster. So bottom up and enlightened top down is something that nobody needs permission for that. The governmental structure will be a following force, not a leading force. And so this really can happen, I think. And I think we both share that optimism, which is good to have. A feeling of hopefulness, I think. You're hopeful, I imagine.
I'd like to distinguish between hope and optimism, if I can. Maybe this is the place to conclude this conversation. I mean, we could go on forever, but I know we both have other things to do. A close friend of mine, and a very famous Jewish rabbi, whose name is just for the second escaping me, but it'll come back to me in a second. That's the problem with age. I can do everything else, but I can't remember names. Once made a distinction between hope and optimism. So here's his distinction. And he's a rabbi, so he's speaking in moral terms. Optimism, he said, is a passive virtue. Optimism is sort of staying back, watching what's happening and saying, yep, things are going the right direction, or nope, I'm pessimistic. It's a passive virtue. Hope, he said, is an active virtue. Hope is saying, well, I know how this could be better, and I'm going to do my damnedest to make it better. And so I think, I'm not sure whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic about America today, but I'm very hopeful that is to say, I can see how it could be better, and I suspect you are too. You can see how it could be better, and you're doing your damnedest to make sure it goes in that direction. So the answer to your question is, I am hopeful. I'm not sure whether I'm optimistic.
Well, that's a great distinction to make, and what I'll add to complete this wonderful conversation is that one thing that contributes to hope is a genuine feeling that there is a path, that we actually do know what to do. So if you don't know what to do, then I think that's just, you can't be hopeful if you don't see the path. But right. I think that if you do see a path, and no matter what the probability is, so the probability might be very low, that's where your optimism and pessimism comes in. But if you do see a path, then it makes you hopeful, and it basically incentivizes you, it motivates you to, whatever the odds, to follow that path. And so I think that is, I think that's probably the best way for us to end this wonderful conversation.
Thanks very much, David. I really enjoyed it a lot. It's quite striking, isn't it, that two people have come to very different paths, along very different paths, end up at the same meeting point.
Well, that's why you're channeling Tocqueville and I'm channeling Darwin.
Okay. Thanks a lot.